First of all, anybody not get a copy of the outline for this course this morning? Who's got the outlines? Are we all out of them? Somebody talk to me, I'm lonely. Are we all out? Huh? And are we all out? Are we out? Okay. Are we people who passed the outlines out? Are we all out of them? Out of the outlines? Yes. Okay.
I'll get one later. It's okay.
Johnny, could you go to the office and have them run off? How many people need outlines? Just raise your hand. Okay. Just one of a sudden. That's it.
I can share it.
No.
Go ahead and get 10 more. Okay. Thank you. Okay, what you will need at this course for this week is the outline, because I'm going to ask you to read ahead of me. Secondly, you should receive the harmony when you check through. Everybody should have a copy of the harmony of the Gospels, this one here. You should have your Bibles as well. We will now and then need to look at certain references, not often, but we need to look at the references. Uh-oh.
No, I'm just going to borrow one. I got one at home. I'm just going to borrow one. Harmony? You have a harmony?
No, this is not harmony. The harmony's over there,
Yeah, but I want this book. No, I'm just...
This is volume 4, the big deal. You'll have to put up with him. He's from Brooklyn, New York. To the far left, there should be harmony there. Okay. Okay, this is going to be the 25-hour version of the course, so we're going to handle things a bit differently than we did the previous 5 weeks. In that, I'm going to, not during the class time itself, we have 5 classes each day, I won't be opening up the floor for questions during the class because of the amount of material we have to cover. But at the end of each night, after the last lecture, we're going to give about a 5-minute break for those who want to leave. If you want to stay for questions, then there'll be questions until 9:30 for any questions that have come up. So any questions that come up during the teaching session, kind of mark those on the side. And each night, there'll be a time to ask those questions. For those of you that are not comfortable asking questions from the floor, there is a box here. You can also write out your questions on a piece of paper. We'll need to supply you with some paper here. And you can put those in the box. Otherwise, as always, I take questions from the floor either way. So either way is fine. Now, as far as material, I'll be making many references to rabbinic teachings and doctrines and so on, especially from the 1st century AD period. But I don't have time to give you my sources at each of these classes. So there's two ways you can. One way to get all the sources, we have a 4-volume set that's in white cover, and this gives you all my references, all of my rabbinic quotations, also other quotations from other different sources. So if you're interested in all of the sources, then you would want to get a hold of the 4-volume set, or it's also in the library, so it's always available to you during the non-lecture use of this lecture hall. You can easily go ahead and get a look at these, and they follow the same order as is going to be in your harmony. Now, for most people who are not that interested in all the sources, we put out also in black cover an abridged version. As far as how it handles the gospel, the material in here and here's the same. What's in this set of books is all my sources and all my references, whereas this does not. There's almost no footnotes here. Doesn't deal with all the sources and so on. Just deals with the content of the 4 Gospels in harmonious order. And so that is also available either for sale or you can use it in the library as well. So just so you know the differences between these 2 sets. Now, on the outline, you'll notice the word para. That's short for paragraph. More correct, it should have been segments. They'll probably change the wording in next year's system, but the order will remain the same. But if these para 1, 2, and so on, that's based upon the harmony you have in your hand. And so it'll always be good if you can read ahead of me, because I won't take time to do much reading in the class, but read ahead of me. And when you get to a section that may have 2 Gospels, 3 Gospels, or 4 Gospels, don't just read one Gospel and the shortest one of that, but rather if there's 2 columns, read both, 3 columns, read all 3, 4 columns, read all 4, because the differences between one Gospel and another will be brought out in these lectures, so it'd be good if you read all of the content in the afternoons. And so that's the way we'll be treating the material. Now, some other things by way of introduction concerning how we're going to use this explanation slide. The main life division will be the one in Roman numerals, Roman 1, Roman 2, and so on. And there'll be 10, 11 main divisions, and that's the main division of the harmony. Then the subdivisions, capital A, Arabic 1, these are the subdivisions within the main division. And that gives you basically the content of each subdivision and sub-subdivision. The upper right-hand corner, it will be the paragraph number, meaning this is the paragraph we're in your harmony. Now, in case you want to pursue certain studies in certain paragraphs, we have 2 copies of all our 198 manuscripts. Not all of them are the life of Messiah, but quite a bit of them are. So if there is a manuscript that you can look at specifically to a paragraph in the harmony, that's the number in the upper left-hand corner. So manuscript number 127 would be relevant to a specific paragraph or section of the harmony, and you can get all of the details of what we're dealing with at that point. Now here you can see the sequence, the main divisions of the harmony. And altogether you have 12, but the number 12 is just certain sequels. So there's 11 specific divisions we'll be going through. You have 2 sections on the introductory material. When we get to the main elements, there'll be 11 main divisions, which we intend to cover by the time Friday night comes. Also, the song, you notice, really sang one song. So also to get some extra time to cover everything, we'll only be singing one song to open up each of the 5 sessions of the study. So let's begin with the introductory material. And let's go to a paragraph or section number 1. Now, section 1 deals with Luke's prologue and the sources of his knowledge. Now, to put it in the wider context of the 4 Gospels, let's imagine a circle. Inside the circle is everything Yeshua said, everything he taught, everything he did from the time he was conceived until his ascension. And as John points out at the end of chapter 20 of his gospel, it would have been impossible for anyone to be able to record everything that he said, did, and teach. He points out the world could not contain the books that would need to be written to cover every little detail. And so all 4 gospels needed to be selective of what they would record. And what they would choose to record will be based upon the individual themes of the individual gospel writers. And even when when two of them or three of them, and in one case all four of them record a specific event, the way they choose to report it will depend on the individual theme of each gospel writer. There'll never be any contradictions between the gospels. But the way that they record an event will be dependent upon the specific theme. Let's look at Matthew. Now, Matthew's theme is Yeshua, the Messiah, the King of the Jews. Yeshua, the Messiah, the King of the Jews. His audience is the Jewish audience. And so he's particularly concerned with many things that are directly relevant to the Jewish audience. And he looks at event A in the circle, and event A does help him portray the theme he wants to develop. So he'll pull event A and record into the gospel. He looks at event B. And B is the event that actually happened, or a teaching that actually happened, but it does not portray the specific theme that Matthew would like to develop. And therefore, he chooses not to record event B. Looks at event C. And C is also something that would portray a specific theme, so he pulls it out of the circle and records it in his gospel. Then Mark comes along, and Mark looks at event A like Matthew did, and while it helped Matthew, it doesn't help Mark to develop his theme, so he chooses to ignore that specific event or teaching. He looks at event B. Well, B was not helpful to Matthew, it is helpful to Mark, and so Mark does record the B event. He looks at event C, and while C was helpful to Matthew, it's also helpful to Mark, and so Mark will also record event C. But the way Matthew records it and the way Mark records it, the differences are based upon the theme they're developing. And there are those differences as far as what's being reported and recorded. It says none of these things are going to, as we shall see, contradict one writer against the other. So let's talk about the different themes of each of the Gospels. Matthew's theme is Yeshua the Messiah, the King of the Jews. That's his theme. He's the Messianic King. Now, each of these Gospel writers were written to meet specific needs of specific groups, and the first need would be rise among the Jewish believers, especially once they had the stoning of Stephen. The Messianic community began to scatter to different parts of the ancient Middle East, to Damascus and to Syria and places which is now in the areas of Lebanon and so on. Up until they were all stationed in Jerusalem, they could go to an apostle who was an eyewitness and ask, what did he teach about this or that? But now they no longer had direct access to any of the apostles, so they needed an authoritative source to fall back on. And Matthew wrote to meet that need. So he's writing for the Jews. His purpose, to explain and prove that Yeshua indeed was the Messianic King. Because the same question that Jewish people object to today is the same objection nobody raised. If he was the Messiah, what happened to the kingdom? And in modern times, what happened to world peace? So what he has to do is, on one hand, show that Yeshua really was the Messianic King, but also to show and explain why the Messianic kingdom was not set up. And as we shall see, he writes in light of impending judgment, the judgment that will come in the year AD 70. So he writes his gospel before that year arrives, but he knows that the impending judgment will come because of specific prophecies the Messiah made. Then we have Mark. And his theme is Yeshua, the Messiah, the servant of Yahweh, the servant of Jehovah. He writes specifically for the Romans. And the Romans were far more interested in action than in teaching. And the ideal Roman was somebody who could receive a commission, carry the commission out, and then come back and say the mission was accomplished. So his interest is on the rapidity, the quickness of action. Over 40 different times he uses a specific Greek word. It's rendered in 3 different English ways, sometimes straight away, sometimes immediately, and sometimes forthwith. Straight away, immediately, forthwith. And so the work carries a sense of urgency, a sense of immediacy, a sense of getting the job done. But he doesn't forget the Jewish background, so what he uses to portray him as the servant of Yahweh is the servant of Jehovah passages that we got to study this week, the previous 3 weeks, concerning the book of Isaiah, because that's where this concept comes from. And so he pictures Yeshua as the servant of Isaiah, like Isaiah chapter 42, 49, 50, and 52, 53. He is moving rapidly to get the mission done and provide the atonement. Now we come to the Gospel of Luke. Now Luke's theme is Yeshua, the Messiah, the Son of Man. Yeshua, the Messiah, the Son of Man, and he especially portrays him as the man in his human characteristics. He often emphasizes how often he was hungry, how often he was thirsty, how often he was tired. God never gets hungry or thirsty or tired. He that keeps Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. These are not attributes of deity, they're attributes of humanity. So focusing on the humanity of the Messiah. He writes for the Greek population. The Greeks had 2 main interests. First of all, the concept of the ideal man, and the ideal man who is self-disciplined both mentally and physically. Mentally, so they were especially interested in the studies of philosophy. Earliest human philosophies come from Greek sources. But secondly, interested in the accuracy and chronological sequence of history. Much of our knowledge of ancient history, like Egyptian history, was not from Egyptian sources. Some is, but a lot of it comes from early historical Greek historians and Greek writers. And the Greeks were especially interested in these 2 things: accurate history and chronological sequence, the concept of the ideal man, so they came up with the original Olympics, where one is disciplined in body as well as mind, and to play in the Olympics. Now, of those 4 gospel writers, he's the only one that was not an eyewitness of any of those events. He became a believer as part of Paul's journeys. So he ultimately also took up Paul's concerns. He himself was not an eyewitness, which he admits in these first 4 verses. So verse 1, for as much as many have taken the hand to draw up a narrative concerning those materials which have been fulfilled among us. So he points out there's already been others who chose to write accounts. Even if they delivered them, initially these were oral accounts, who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. And these early accounts come from first-class eyewitnesses, of which he was not. So why did he feel to write his own gospel? He explains this in verse 3. It seems good to me also, having traced the course of all things accurately from the first, to write unto you in order. Most excellent Theophilus, the same person he dedicated the Gospel of Luke to. This is volume 2, the work of the book of Acts. Notice the word in order. The Greek word means chronological order or sequential order. Chronological order or sequential order. So he does what Matthew, Mark, and John did not choose to do. And so the order in Matthew, Mark, and Luke may not necessarily happen in chronological sequence. But Luke tells us specifically he's writing chronological sequence. So if there's a difference between Luke, Matthew, and Luke, Mark, and Luke, John, and Luke, we always follow Luke's order. And by writing a strict chronological sequence of these historical events, verse 4, that you may know the certainty concerning the things wherein you were instructed. Now, as we shall work to the Gospel of Luke, we'll also see he has three main concerns. Three special areas of interest. Number one, Jerusalem. And we'll learn things about what he said about Jerusalem, or that what he did in Jerusalem, not recorded in Matthew, Mark, or John. A second key concern is Gentiles. Having become a believer through Paul's ministry, they began to share concerns of Paul, who was the apostle to the Gentiles. So we shall see references to Gentiles that we will not find in Matthew, Mark, and John. And the third key concern is women. And we shall see things about women, either those who ministered to him or he ministered to them, but also recorded only by him and not by the others. And this will become apparent even in the very beginnings of his gospel. We'll point these out. The last gospel writer was John. He writes rather late in life, somewhere between 90 and 95 AD. And while Luke was emphasizing the humanity of the Messiah, John emphasizes the deity of the Messiah. So his theme is Yeshua the Messiah, the Son of God. On one hand, he's writing for the church at large, no specific ethnic group, for the church at large, to defend the deity of the Messiah. He also has two sub-themes. His main theme, Yeshua the Messiah, the Son of God, but two sub-themes. The first sub-theme is the conflict of light and darkness. The conflict of light and darkness. And he introduces the Shekinah light motif in the very first chapter, and he develops this light motif throughout his gospel. The second sub-theme, this one came to reveal the Father to men. It came to reveal the Father to men. So while Mark is far more interested in the actions of the Messiah, John is far more interested in the teachings of the Messiah. We have messages, we have sermons, we have discourses in John's Gospel, not found in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. All of these discourses, he's focusing on revealing the Father to humanity. Now, he also likes to work around the number 7. He's got 3 sets of 7s, which I will point out as we come to them. But there are 7 discourses, 7 I am statements, and 7 signs. Now, while he's writing for the church at large, he has another key purpose that only reveals at the end of chapter 20. These things are written that you may believe that Yeshua is the Messiah, the Son of God, and believing it, you may have life in his name. It also has the evangelistic purpose for the church to carry out. Now, the 7 signs that he's going to detail should be sufficient to get someone to truly believe that he's the messianic person, the messianic king. Now we come to section 2, which is John's prologue to his account of the life of the Messiah. He focuses on the pre-existence of the Messiah, already opening up with the theme, which will be the deity of the Messiah. He begins with a verse that a lot of people already know, memorized. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And as most of you already may know, if not all of you, the Greek term he uses, the term logos. And because he mentions the term logos, most commentaries on John begin to go into rather lengthy dissertation to explain what logos meant in terms of Greek philosophy. They may take a few pages to say it, or they may even take many pages to say it, but in the end they say the same thing. In Greek philosophy, the logos had 2 concepts: the concept of reason and the concept of speech. And then after letting us know that the logos had these 2 concepts of reason and speech, what they try to say is that what John is doing in these 18 verses is showing how Yeshua came to fulfill the goals of Greek philosophy, in that by reason, he was the very idea of God, and that by speech, he was the very expression of God. Read almost any commentary on John, this is what you'll read, except for 2 exceptions that I come across. Now, this is all nice to know, but what these commentators forget is that by profession, John was not a Greek philosopher. He was a Jewish fisherman. What really has in mind is not Greek philosophy, but Jewish theology of that day. Now, because of the way the term word appears throughout the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew word is davar. The rabbis developed by the 1st century Judaism a complete theology on this term davar, but to distinguish the theology from the use of the word in general, they used the Aramaic term memra. So davar is Hebrew, memra is the Aramaic equivalent. And since John was writing his gospel in Greek, he would need a Greek term to translate the Jewish memra. The only Greek term he could use is the term logos. He's writing about the logos. He's not thinking in terms of the logos of Greek philosophy, but rather the rabbinic theology of the memra. Now, by 1st century Judaism, the rabbis developed 6 key points about the memra. And all 6 of these points are going to come out in these first 18 verses. First of all, the memra was sometimes distinct from God, but sometimes the same as God. In all the writings, the rabbis do not try to distinguish, not try to explain the paradox. How could the memra be distinct from God and yet be God at the same time? They simply made both statements being true and left it there. Which is what John just did here in verse 1. Notice, when he says he was with God, the Logos was with God, he makes him distinct from God. Then he turns around and says the Logos was God, which makes him the same as God. At this point, like the rabbis, he does not try to explain the paradox. How could he be both with God and be God? But unlike the rabbis, he does explain it later in his gospel, and to some extent in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd epistles of John, that the one he's writing about is distinct from God because he's not God the Father or God the Holy Spirit, yet he's the same as God in that he is God the Son. Only in terms of this triunity can this rabbinic paradox be truly understood. Secondly, the memra was also the agent of creation. If you look at verse 3, for example, All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that had been made. And here points out that he was the agent of creation. Everything was made through him. So what we see in this whole universe, in this expansive universe, it was the means by which they came into existence was by means of the memory, by means of the word. This was derived from passages like Genesis chapters 1 and 2, where you see, and God said, 3 words in English, only 1 word in Hebrew. And what he said will suddenly come into creation. So everything we see was created through the memra. Without the memra, nothing would exist, which now does exist. And here in verse 3, John points out the same thing is true of John's Logos. All things were made through him. Without him, nothing would exist, which now does exist because he's also the agent of creation. Thirdly, he's also the agent of salvation. Whenever God saved anything throughout the history, whether there was a physical salvation like the Exodus, or a spiritual salvation of imparting to someone eternal life, physical or spiritual, he always saved by means of the memra, by means of the word. And so skip down to verse 12. As many as received him, to them gave he the right to become children of God, even to them that believe on his name. And now we learn that this one, his Logos, is also the agent of salvation. Is those individual Jews and Gentiles who believe in him, who accept him, they're the ones who receive salvation because he's also the agent of salvation. And by the way, in verses 4 through 9, you have this first contrast of light and darkness, and this will come up over and over again. If I was teaching only the Gospel of John, I would begin to explain what he means, to exegete what he means. But we're dealing here with a survey of the whole life of Messiah using all 4 Gospels. I won't be able to take the time to do that, but if you're doing, if I was teaching only the Gospel of John, I could do it, but since we're doing a harmonious study of all 4 Gospels, I'll point out where it is so that you can make these studies on your own, but I will not be expanding on this. Now the 4th teaching about the memra is the means by which God takes on visible form. And throughout the history of the Hebrew Bible, you will notice now and then God took on some kind of visible form. When he did so, it was done by means of the memra, by means of the word. Now in Christian theology, they use the term theophany. Theophany is a Greek term. And whenever God becomes visible in some form, then that's a theophany. The rabbis had a different term to say the same thing, and the rabbinic term was the term Shekhinah, often connected with God's glory, and so they coupled the words together, the Shekinah, glory of God. And by way of definition, the Shekinah glory was the visible manifestation of the invisible God. So whenever the invisible God became visible, whenever his omnipresence was localized, this is the Shekhinah. And through most of biblical history, it came one of 3 forms, either as a light, or a fire, or a cloud. Light, fire, cloud, or some combination of these 3 things. Now, these are not the only ways. There are other Shekinah manifestations, but these are the primary ways in the history of the Hebrew Bible, either individually or combination thereof. And this is the visible manifestation of the glory of God. This is the Shekhinah. Now, when the Greeks came in contact with the Jewish world following the conquest of Alexander the Great, they came across this word. They liked what the word conveyed, and they wished to incorporate the word the word was already there in Greek, but I wished to incorporate the word into their language with this special meaning. But there was one problem. In Hebrew, we have a letter, the letter shin, by which you can make the sha sound. In English, you have to combine two letters, S and H, to make the sha sound. In German, for example, you have to combine three letters, SCH, to make the sha sound. But in Hebrew, one letter is sufficient. But in Greek, you cannot combine any number of letters to get the sha sound. Now, Greek has a hard S. They can say s, but they cannot say sh. And that's why the Greeks were so much louder than we Jews were, and gave us headaches to our Jewish history, out of which Hanukkah came about. But that's a December story, which I won't get into now. So what he did was simply harden the S sound, and the Greek word here is skene. Many of you know the word Hosanna from the New Testament. Well, Hosanna is simply the Greek form for the Hebrew Hoshana, with the S sound hardened. And as the footnote will show you, the real meaning of the Greek word skene does not mean to dwell. So in English it reads in verse 14, notice, the Logos that back in verse 1 was in the beginning with God, or as was God, became flesh. He became human, he became man, a unique manifestation of the Shekhinah. And notice the word dwelt, but he does not use the normal Greek word for dwelling. The word he uses means what you see in the footnote, to tabernacle. So literally, skene, the Greek form for Shekhinah, means to tabernacle. So he came and tabernacled among us, because the origin of this word in the Hebrew goes all the way back to the book of Exodus, chapter 40, where the Shekinah glory in the form of a cloud took up residency within the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle. For the next several centuries, they tabernacled with the people of Israel. It later transferred from the tabernacle to the first temple. But then the days of Ezekiel, and Ezekiel describes this in chapters 8 through 11 of his book, Ezekiel 8 through 11, that in 4 specific stages, the Shekinah departed from Israel and went back to heaven. And when the second temple was built, the Shekinah did not return. But now, after 6 centuries of absence, the Shekinah returns, but not in the form of a light, fire, and cloud, but in the form of flesh. And once again, tabernacled with the people of Israel. And like the rabbis, notice how quickly John connects this with God's glory. And we beheld his glory. Glory is of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. Normally, the Shekinah glory exudes light. There has a brightness about it. But the physical body of the Messiah was like a veil. It veiled the brightness of his glory. So when people looked upon him in first century Israel, he did not look much different than other Jewish male of first century Israel. But one time during his public ministry, the Shekinah light came through at the event called the Transfiguration. That's the event we'll look at when we get to it this week. And the Shekinah light came through the veil, affecting his clothing, making them exceptionally white. His face began to shine with the brightness of the sun, and 3 of his apostles saw the brightness of his glory. One of whom is the author of this gospel, the Gospel of John. So he writes like an eyewitness, we beheld his glory. Something they saw on the Transfiguration Mount, and they saw the brightness of his Shekinah glory. So just as the Memra was the means by which God took on visible form, the same thing is true of John's Logos. Now the fifth thing about the Memra is also the means which God signs his covenants. In the history of the Hebrew Bible, God makes a total of 8 covenants, 3 of which are made with humanity in general, but 5 are made specifically with the Jewish people, but all were signed and sealed by the Memra by means of the word. So looking now at verse 17. As many as received him, to them gave he the right to become children of God, even to them that believe in his name. Verse 17. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Yeshua the Messiah. The law of Moses was signed and sealed by the Shekinah glory in the book of Exodus chapter 24, verses 1 through 11. Exodus 24, 1 through 11. But new age of grace will be signed by means of the shedding of his blood on the cross. So what is that? He signed, he sealed, he ratified the new covenant, which means he is also a covenant signer. Now, the last thing about the Memra is the agent of revelation. Everything that we know about God, we only know because the Memra chose to reveal him. Derived from those so many passages in the Hebrew Bible, the word of the Lord came to this prophet, the word of God to that one. So we know about God's revelation about himself. Is what the Memra chose to reveal, especially to Moses and the prophets. Now look at verse 18. No man has seen God any time, the only begotten Son, who is the bosom of his Father, hath declared them or hath revealed him. Now again, John's main theme is Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. But he has those two sub-themes, one of which I mentioned, revealed the Father to men. And so through those many discourses we find in John's Gospel, he's revealing the nature of the Father to men. John Long recalls an incident where a disciple asked Yeshua, show us the Father. The Messiah says, you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Everything true about the divine nature of the Father is true of the Son. And so to know the Son is to know the Father. Because he's also the agent of revelation. So John's main theme in the gospel is not that he came to fulfill the goals of Greek philosophy. Rather, he came to fulfill the messianic Jewish hope, and this, we can summarize it in these 4 points. The Memra, the Logos, the Word came in visible form. Second, the world in general did not recognize him. Thirdly, his own Jewish people did not recognize him either. But fourthly, those individual Jews who, and Gentiles who did recognize him, they became the children of God and received their salvation from him who is the agent of salvation. So again, this is not fulfilling Greek philosophy, it's fulfilling the Jewish messianic hope. Now we come to the first main division of his life, comprising section 3 through 27. 3 through 27, with section 3 dealing with the genealogy of the Messiah. Now we have many genealogies in the Hebrew Bible. We only have 2 genealogies in the New Testament. And that's in Matthew and Luke. That these are the only 2 gospel writers that deal with his birth and early life, because Mark and John begin their gospel accounts with him already an adult. And so these 2 would naturally explain why would they have genealogies. Now, while we have these 2 accounts of his birth and early life, they're told from 2 different perspectives. Now, Matthew tells the story from Joseph's perspective. So in the Gospel of Matthew, Joseph plays the active role, Miriam plays the passive role. Angels come to him, but not to her. And we're told what Joseph is thinking, we're told what's going on in his mind. He tells us nothing about what Mary is thinking. On the other hand, Luke tells the same story, but he tells it from Miriam's perspective, so everything is reversed. She plays the active role, he plays a passive one. Angel comes to her, but not to him. And we're told what she is thinking, what goes on in her mind, not a word about what he is thinking. So if you go by context alone, if that's the only thing to base it on, going by context alone, the genealogy of Matthew would be that of Joseph, while the genealogy of Luke would be that of Miriam. But as Matthew himself will point out, Joseph was not the biological father of Yeshua. There's no blood tie connection. So why do we need his genealogy? And for that, we have to look back into the Hebrew Bible. What we learn is that there are two requirements for kingship in the Hebrew Bible. The first requirement is you have to be of Davidic descent. You have to be of the house of David. And this was applicable to the southern kingdom of Judah. And the capital of Judah was Jerusalem. But then came a second requirement, which was applicable to the northern kingdom of Israel. And the capital of Israel was Samaria. And the requirement there was prophetic sanction or divine appointment. Prophetic sanction or divine appointment. So unless one received prophetic sanction and or divine appointment, he would have no right to sit upon the throne of Samaria. Anyone who tried to sit on that throne without this sanction ends up being assassinated. So one example, God told Jehu that his seed will be ruling in Samaria for 4 generations, and 4 generations did. When the 5th one in the line tried to sit upon the throne, he ended up being assassinated. And both these rules are going to be applied in the genealogies as we go through it. Now looking at Matthew's account, Matthew breaks with Jewish law and Jewish tradition in 2 ways. First of all, he skips names. He skips names because he wants to get 3 sets of 14. And the significance of the number 14 is that is the numerical value of David's name in Hebrew. In classical Hebrew, we didn't have a separate system for letters and numbers as we do in modern Hebrew. So every letter was also a number. So every letter has numerical value, every word has numerical value, every name written in Hebrew characters will have a numerical value. A numerical value of the name David is 14. And he connects the coming of the Messiah with David in the very first verse. The second way he breaks with Jewish law is that he does not name any woman. In Jewish tradition, you did not name a woman in a genealogy, and Matthew breaks with that by naming 4 women at the beginning of the genealogy. Also ends up with the last woman, which would be Miriam. Now, the 4 women in the genealogy all have, he breaks with the Jewish law with this, and he has a reason for doing so. First of all 4 of these women were Gentiles. All 4 of these women were Gentiles. And secondly, all 4 of these women were guilty of specific 3 of these women were guilty of specific sexual sins. For example, in verse 3, Tamar, she was guilty of incest. Then you have Rahab, she was guilty of prostitution. Then the pronoun her in verse 6 refers to Bathsheba, and she was guilty of adultery. The only one not guilty of a sexual sin is Ruth in verse 5. She was the result of one, she was a Moabitess. The Moabites came from an incestuous relationship between Lot and one of his daughters. So it begins to hint that not while in Matthew the primary purpose of Messiah's coming was for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, but there'll be reports in Matthew's gospel of his ministry to Gentiles. As he begins to trace the genealogy, he begins, or the early paragraphs or sections connect the coming of Messiah with specific Jewish covenants. In the very first verse, he's the son of David, connecting Messiah with the Davidic covenant, and then the son of Abraham, connecting the coming of the Messiah with the Abrahamic covenant. And so the Messiah will be the son of Abraham and of the house of David. He begins his genealogy with Abraham because he's writing to Jews, and the history of the Jews begins with Abraham. So he starts with Abraham and not Adam. And his theme of Jewish kingship would fit with that concept. And he traces down in verse 6 to David. And from David's sons, he picks one, Shlomo or Solomon, and traces the line at the end of verse 10. And that is verse 11. And where Josiah begat Jeconiah. And he'll become crucial. And then in verse 12, he picks it up with Jeconiah, goes to verse 16, where he deals with Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Yeshua. Now, in Greek, the word whom is only feminine, which means he does not connect Joseph as the biological father, only Miriam as the biological mother. And the mention of Jeconiah is significant. Now take your Bibles and turn to Jeremiah 22. Jeremiah 22. In Jeremiah 22, the prophet raises up curses of the last several kings of Jerusalem before the captivity begins. And beginning at verse 24, he picks the last one in this chapter, using the short name Coniah for Jeconiah. And because of the kind of individual man was, the curse begins with the fact that he will be captured alive, he'll go into captivity, he will die in Babylonian captivity, never to see his homeland again. But then the high point of the curse is about to be reached in verse 29. Notice he calls upon the earth 3 times over, "O earth, 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 hear the word of Jehovah." And the high point of the curse for the whole world to hear is in verse 30. Thus says Jehovah, write thee this man childless, a man that shall not prosper in his days. For no more shall a man of his seed prosper, sitting upon the throne of David and ruling in Judah. The high point of the curse is that no descendant of Jeconiah will have the right to rule upon the throne of David. Now, normally, when you ask people, theologians, about why these 2 genealogies, the answer usually is Matthew gives us the royal line, Luke gives us the real line. And what they mean by the royal line is that Joseph was the heir apparent to David's throne. And since he was the heir apparent to David's throne, that means because he adopted Yeshua as his adopted son, Yeshua can claim the right to sit upon the throne of David through his connection of Joseph by means of adoption. However, Luke shows that biologically he was also a descendant of David through his mother Miriam. That's the normal answer, but according to this curse, that cannot be correct. no descendant of David, no descendant of Jeconiah could sit upon the throne of David. So going back to our harmony, we learn that Joseph was not the heir apparent to David's throne. And therefore he had no right to sit upon David's throne. So if Yeshua was the biological son of Joseph, his real son, that would disqualify Yeshua from sitting upon the throne. And Matthew, writing to Jews that would know about the Jeconiah curse, he writes that while Yeshua was the legal son of Joseph, he was not the biological son of Joseph. And so the very next thing he does is give the account of the virgin conception or virgin curse, a virgin conception and the virgin birth. So while the first requirement to be sitting upon the throne of David, you have to be a member of the house of David, but now there's a sub-element, an additional limitation. He still had to be a member of the house of David, but apart from Jeconiah. Apart from Jeconiah. And that's what happens in Matthew's gospel. He gives the genealogy, presents the Jeconiah problem, then he solves it by the account of the virgin conception, virgin birth. Okay, take your, before we leave this part, then we'll take a break and then we'll go to Luke's account. But what we find in the genealogy of the four sonships of the Messiah, son of David, he is a king. Son of Abraham, he is a Jew. Son of Adam, he is human. Son of David, the Son of God, he is God. Okay, we're going to finish with section 3 and take a 15-minute break.